Hello everyone, my name is Rhys Kościński. This is Simple Philosophy, where we simplify philosophers to help you better understand life. In today's video, we are going to be starting the first in our series of one of the foundational thinkers of Western philosophy, which is Plato.
And here come the Greeks, led out by their veteran centre-half, Heraclitus.
In this series, I'm going to be joined by Sean Ledwith, who has joined me on various other videos on this channel. He is a philosophical expert, particularly on the greats of philosophy. But not only is he a philosophical expert, he is also an ancient historian too. So in today's first part of the series on Plato, we're going to be taking a look at the historical context of Plato and the historical and philosophical background that he emerges from, so that we can better understand his arguments and his philosophical concepts later in the series. If you enjoy this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe. If you can, please leave me a comment in the comment box below, as it helps the channel out. And without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so we'll start with the kind of assumption, or at least a highly stated assumption, that Plato is one of the greatest philosophers, at least in the Western world. And you've selected a series of quotes here from various scientists, philosophers, and sociologists even. And I don't know if you want to expand on that very quickly.
Yeah, the first one is probably the most famous thing that anyone said about Plato, is that by Whitehead, who was an English philosopher in the 20th century, that essentially the entire history of Western philosophy since the 5th century BC has been a sequence of footnotes to Plato. And what Whitehead meant by that is that Plato really set the stage for philosophy in terms of its main branches. So epistemology, political philosophy, ethics, aesthetics. Plato is really the starting point for practically every other discussion. I think Whitehead is also trying to get us to realise Plato is the greatest philosopher. It's obviously an open question, but he's certainly the starting point. And it's very difficult to make a case that he isn't the greatest philosopher, because I say, for someone who's living that long ago, still to be the starting point just shows the impact he had. And I think the other thing worth pointing out, I think that Plato is a great place to start. If you're new to philosophy, just start reading either the Symposium or the Republic. Plato had a fantastic conversational style. And he asked the sort of fundamental questions, I say, about epistemology, about political philosophy. What is truth? What is justice? What is beauty? That really anyone coming to philosophy for the first time really starts to engage with. So that's really what Whitehead was pointing out. Now the quote from Popper. Popper was a sort of influential, essentially right-wing thinker in the sort of mid-20th century, quite influential in the sort of the rise of neoliberalism, essentially. And Popper had this sort of viewpoint that Plato, in many ways, was the to blame for the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, because Plato's political utopia is essentially a totalitarian state that essentially suppresses free speech and diversity in the name of order. So Popper, I think most people say, rather crassly tried to blame Plato for the likes of Stalin and Hitler. And again, although I think Popper's fundamentally wrong here, Popper does rightly highlight how Plato is such a massively important political philosopher. Now, the quote from Badiou is probably the most influential thinker on the left these days, just points out, I think it's very difficult to appropriate Plato either for left or right. I think obviously these terms left or right are really from the sort of the modern era, and in many ways don't apply that straightforwardly to the ancient world. But I think Badiou's comment makes a point that you can actually make a case for Plato as a thinker who in many ways is very useful for the left. I think what Badiou is talking about is in many ways Plato was the first one he meant it to underline the importance of theory, the importance of not just interacting with the world in a sort of empirical way, but trying to step back to theorize. And of course, the whole development of the left in terms of great thinkers like Marx and Lenin and Trotsky is the importance of theorizing. So what Badiou was talking about here is that for Badiou, that is the fundamental significance of Plato as a thinker who the left should not dismiss. I mean, Popper's viewpoint in many ways is a very influential one, that Plato is essentially a philosopher of dictatorship. But I think Badiou is trying to make us realize that is a rather simplistic view, and that actually we should engage with Plato in a more subtle and sympathetic sort of way, essentially.
And I think as we go ahead, you can probably make connections with Plato and the other videos that we've done as well, because without Plato, there probably wouldn't be any Hegel, particularly end up discussing the dialectics and things like that. So we probably should have started here in the first place, shouldn't we?
Yeah, so in that sense, Plato is the greatest philosopher because he really sets the stage. He provides the foundation for all the other great thinkers like Kant and Hegel. Really, I would say without Kant and Hegel, their interaction with Plato, there is no Western philosophy. And then the whole debate about empiricism v rationalism, which really shapes Western philosophy, it's right there in the ancient world with the theoretical debates between Plato and Aristotle. So that's really what Whitehead was getting at, is that Plato must be the starting point for any serious philosophical discussion.
So let's get into Plato's historical background. Now, this is normally your day job, isn't it? Discussing the ancient world and the background. So you could probably expand on this in far more detail than I could.
Yeah, and I think this is something that most people who study and teach philosophy at higher education don't really engage with this context, which I think is essential to understand, because you really have to pitch Plato right into the middle of what was a hugely tumultuous political period in the 5th and the 4th century BC in Greece, because you had a real pinnacle of philosophical, artistic, social, and political conflict. And I think unless you're aware about that, the establishment projects a view as Plato as a rather sort as a thinker who just sort of appeared out of thin air with fantastic ideas. But I think unless you contextualize Plato right in the middle of this huge cyclone of conflict in this period, then it doesn't really make any sense. And the background to it is really the second point. There is that in the around about 510 in Athens, there was essentially a major democratic breakthrough. So in Athens at this point, you had really a fundamental class conflict involving a number of classes. So at the top, the traditional landowning aristocracy. And then because of the development of commerce in the Aegean in the 6th and 5th centuries BC, you really had the rise of a new sort of mercantile urban class. And the conflict between those two for political power in Athens is this fundamental context of Plato. In terms of politics, the key figure in the first line was Pericles, who was really the dominant political personality from about 460 to 430 in Athens. Pericles really represented the viewpoint of this new urban, mercantile, maritime trading class that in many ways ran into conflict with the traditional landowning aristocracy in Athens. And in order for Pericles to consolidate his power, he also had to appeal to an even poorer class in Athens, who you might loosely call the working, not the slaves, but the urban working class in Athens. So Pericles had to empower those people in order to confront the landowning aristocracy. So in the 400s in Athens, you have this really tumultuous period of political conflict, and one of the outcomes of that is in the middle of the 5th century, you get the rise of the Athenian Empire, which is sort of the dominant hegemonic power in the Aegean. But again, Pericles is a very skilled political operator, conjoined the maritime expansion of Athens with the consolidation of the Athenian democracy. So in order to persuade the Athenian port to man the boats in the Athenian navy, he had to give them political power. So you have this real, what's sometimes referred to as the golden age of Athenian democracy. So you have poor Athenians who are able to participate in the democracy in a meaningful way. You also have them entitled to participate in the legal system. You have a real flourishing of free speech in Athens. So this is a real democratic advance, obviously hugely limited. Doesn't apply to women, doesn't apply to foreigners, doesn't apply to slaves. And yet in context, this is a huge advance for democracy. Now, I mean, I think we really have to see Plato fundamentally as articulating the argument against these change. When we get to Plato's philosophy, and as Popper sort of picked up on, Plato in many ways can be perceived as a rather reactionary philosopher, because he's very much about suppressing free speech and suppressing democracy. And I think that is because he was brought up in the context of this historical period. Now, the thing about Plato, when we look at his life, talk more about this, is he was related to the Athenian aristocracy. So some of his family were sort of political enemies of the Democrats. So Plato was brought up in some ways with this sort of anti-democratic mentality, and that feeds into his political philosophy. In the second half of the 5th century in Athens, you get this massive military conflict between Sparta and Athens, known as the Great Peloponnesian War. And the Great Peloponnesian War ends up in defeat for Athens, and that triggers a huge debate within Athens about why did Athens lose the Peloponnesian War. And for the political reactionaries, or aristocrats, we might call them in Athens, democracy itself was to blame. The democracy destabilized the Athenian state. And for people of Plato's sort of family and political persuasion, Sparta was really the model. So the Spartans had of course won the Peloponnesian War, and for Plato it was Sparta's essentially hierarchical, aristocratic, oligarchic, totalitarian system that had prevailed. So the lessons for Athens were that the democratic system had brought down Athenian power, and that Sparta's oligarchic political system was the reason for its success. So I think in his political philosophy and also in his epistemology, Plato really assimilates this sort of perspective.
There's some parallels with that today, aren't there? Kind of as you were explaining that there, you can kind of see similar arguments developing in the current context of the modern world.
That's right. I mean, in the Republic, Plato has some remarkable passages where he talks about the dangers of the people being swayed by demagogues. And it's really impossible to read that sort of stuff without thinking about, Trump and Johnson and
even Farage, I guess.
Farage, yeah, people like Duterte in the Philippines. And again, I think this is why Plato, in many ways, is the greatest philosopher, because you can read something like the Republic, and you can read certain passages, and they're almost like they're straight out of the news today. And he talks about the dangers of public opinion being swayed rapidly from viewpoint to viewpoint. And again, I think if you look at the headlines. Now, in Athens, so that there was a Spartan, when the Spartans won the war in 404, that they imposed their own regime known as the 30 Tyrants, which suppressed the democracy. Now, this didn't last long, less than a year. And again, interestingly, it did involve people who Plato was related to. The key leader was a guy called Critias, who was an uncle of Plato's. Now, the Democrats eventually managed to overthrow this pro-Spartan collaborationist regime, essentially, we would say, and the democracy was restored. And of course, the most famous thing the restored democracy ever did was put Socrates on trial and execute him. We'll talk about Socrates a bit, shortly, but Socrates again was perceived as pro-Spartan, anti-democratic. And of course, a huge influence on Plato himself. Traditionally, if you study philosophy at university, you never discuss any of this. But as far as I'm concerned, Plato's philosophy makes no sense unless you situate it slap bang in the middle of this huge period of social and political turbulence in Athens.
So let's start with the philosophical background then. So I assume this is where most philosophy lectures would start, or at least philosophy courses would start.
Yes, but again, I think not sufficient as they should do, because I wouldn't want to reduce Plato and say, well, all Plato did was take these recipes, throw them in a pot and stir them around. But I do think that you have to, again, just like we talked about with the historical background, we have to understand the philosophical background. And again, I think the two are connected. This philosophical turbulence runs parallel to the political turbulence, and I think the two are linked together essentially. So you talk about the 6th century BC, the 5th century BC. So the pre-Socratics are a group of philosophers who are sort of, in some ways, rather not usually lumped together. But the reason for it is that most of these guys, we don't have sustained pieces of work for them surviving. Unfortunately, most of them only exist as fragments. So they are known as the Pre-Socratics because they came before Socrates, who we'll talk about shortly. So there's an event known as the Ionian Revolution. Ionia is off what we would call Turkey today, just off the west coast of Turkey. And the Ionian Revolution was really huge advances in astronomy, physics, mathematics. Again, partly because of intellectual currents coming from India, from the Babylonian Empire, and eventually filtering across the Aegean into Europe. Now, the Ionian Revolution also consisted of some strands within it. There was a group called the Milesian School of Materialists based in Miletus, one of these Ionian locations. And in some ways, these are the first group of thinkers to try and separate religion from philosophical reflection. So Thales, working in the sort of middle of the 6th century, sometimes regarded as the first philosopher because he had this viewpoint that the world wasn't made entirely of water. Now, it sounds ridiculous, but of course, when you think about it, actually, he's not entirely wrong, because our planet is overwhelmingly water. Our bodies are mainly water. So these pre-Socratic philosophers had a lot of sort of inspired intuitions, actually. Anaxagoras, he had this. He was one of the first thinkers to argue that the sun is essentially not a sort of an organic entity, as of course religious thinkers had tried to argue, but is essentially a lump of hot rock in space. And again, in the context of the time, that was a remarkable sort of conceptual breakthrough. And Anaxagoras was working in Athens in the second half of the 5th century, and he was expelled from the city for that sort of viewpoint, essentially. So although we tend to think about Athens as a sort of as a cradle of progressive scientific thinking, you always had this huge cultural argument between essentially religion v philosophy. And again, you have to situate Plato's philosophy inside that debate. Democritus, quite well known, I think, he was really the father of atomic theory. The first one to argue that reality is made up of minuscule properties or entities, invisible to the human eye, that essentially are constantly in engagement with each other, and that every object we see is made up of atoms. Now, again, he had no evidence for this. This is just an inspired intuition. Heraclitus, again, I think quite well known. Famously, you can't step into the same river twice. And what he was arguing was that the world in front of us is in a constant state of flux. And again, he is right. Our bodies are changing all the time. You wouldn't know it, but this planet is hurtling through space at thousands of miles an hour inside a solar system and a galaxy that's hurtling through the universe in thousands of miles an hour. So the world, even the world beneath our feet, is constantly shifting and changing.
That's amazing intuition. If you think in the context of modern philosophy, whether it's someone like Deleuze or something like theoretical physics, all of these things are pretty much still being tested and to some extent slowly being proven.
That's right, yeah. And again, I think if you look at a lot of, Heisenberg, one of the great physicists of the 20th century, he wrote a great book about Greek philosophy. He wrote about all these sort of things. And I think, there really is a sort of coming together of these inspired, because these were inspired intuitions, and then the great philosophical breakthrough of the 20th century sort of provide the evidence to back them up. So it is a quite remarkable achievement from these sort of guys. And again, I think you have to put it in the context of the political breakthroughs that were going on in Athens. I think it's a great example of how, in terms of society, if you have inspired thinkers in one field like philosophy, it tends to affect everything else like politics. And because we're not going to talk about the art in Athens, we have great architectural and literary breakthroughs as well. So it's a great example of how a society can take a huge progressive leap in all sort of fields.
Again, it reminds me of Deleuze's book on what is philosophy, where he discusses the purpose of philosophy. And his main argument is the purpose of philosophy is to present the theories for science to prove. And I think that's quite a nice way of actually putting forward what this is all about. And you can see through these thinkers how there is an element of truth in that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And again, I think that's why we need to look at Plato sympathetically, because his great achievement in many ways was to synthesize all these ideas. I say, unfortunately, a lot of these guys, we only have fragments, but Plato, although he doesn't necessarily explicitly refer to these thinkers, you can tell that he assimilates these ideas and tries to put them into some sort of system. So, I think the Western philosophy is essentially totally in Plato's debt for doing that. Now, just in contrast, so another group of philosophers known as the Eleatic school. Now, Elea is a place in southern Italy. And these guys, in some ways, were reacting against the likes of Democritus and Heraclitus, because they were arguing that essentially change is an illusion, and that the universe and things like time are essentially static. Now, again, this might seem counterintuitive, but again, I think there are some very sort of physicists who argue that our sense of time is an illusion, and that past, present, and future are actually all coexisting. in a way that is essentially beyond our comprehension. But obviously, you can sort of take their word that there might be something in it. Zeno is well known for his famous paradoxes. There's one about Achilles and the turtle, that if they have a race, but if you give the turtle a head start, Achilles will never be able to catch him up, because Achilles has to get halfway to where the turtle is, and he has to get halfway to where that point, halfway to that point, infinitely. And again, this is clearly not the case, but Zeno was interested in the paradoxes of motion. And again, really, Zeno said this paradox is not really solved until the sort of 16th and 17th centuries AD, when you get people like Leibniz and Newton come along, and they actually solve this using logarithmic thinking. But a huge intellectual puzzle that in some ways still throws people when you put in front of them today. Now, probably the most famous of the pre-Socratics is Pythagoras, a source of endless stress for countless generations of school children, but thanks to his theorem. But his philosophical ideas were very similar to the Eleatics. In other words, that the world is really characterized by a lack of motion. And of course, for Pythagoras, mathematics as a source of knowledge were really the model. And of course, mathematics, as mathematicians like to tell us, is not subject to the whims and the changes of various societies. Mathematics is rigid, solid, sort of super historical in a sense. And for Pythagoras, that's what made mathematics really the model field of human activity. And again, you look at modern physicists. Some modern physicists argue that the universe is essentially mathematical in terms of its construction. Probably people have heard about the Fibonacci theorem. Is its sort of deepest levels, nature reflects various sorts of mathematical models. Mathematics is sort of built into the structure of nature itself. So again, a remarkable intuition by Pythagoras. And finally, the group at the bottom, the Sophists. Now, these guys in Plato get a very bad rap, basically, because they're accused of being philosophers for hire, who could train people to defend indefensible positions. Now, again, I think that Plato has been a bit hard on these guys, because since these guys were interested in educating people, and educating people regardless of social class. And some of them, in many ways, have very progressive ideas. One of the most famous of the Sophists is a guy called Pythagoras. And he famously said that man is the measure of all things. Now, this has become one of the sort of founding statements of relativism, the viewpoint that ideas do change according to whatever the social context is doing. And again, a lot of modern sociology and anthropology, although it wouldn't entirely agree with the phrase or maybe the ideas fully, is a very sort of influential way of thinking that we should really try and avoid dogmatic, super historical viewpoints, and that we need to be aware about how human societies evolve and have different viewpoints. So the Sophists are scorned by Plato, but again, I think that's probably just his aristocratic bias seeping in.